as you log in, please go ahead and mute your microphone. We will not be using video today, so Megan will be presenting a presentation on screen. We'll be sharing our screen with you today, so no video will be necessary. Thank you.
Wait, live auto check, select auto tab. Let's see if auto tab. Oh, audio. Top of screen. I don't see a chat box.
Heather, I think you're looking for the chat box.
I just realized I'm unmuted. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Go up to the top, put your cursor up to the top, and you'll see View, and then scroll down to Panels.
Panels, okay.
Manage Panels.
Okay.
And you should be able to add your panels from the left over to the right. And click OK.
There's nothing in the left.
Oh, at the bottom, maybe? Yeah, down. Then they should be appearing in little circles down by just above your navigation bar at the bottom of the screen. There's a black microphone, so on and so forth, and there's two blue circles there. Okay, click on the one that has the speech bubble.
Okay.
And your chat box should appear on the right-hand side.
Okay. And I just click on that microphone to mute me?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We'll give everybody just another minute or so to get logged in here. Well, I want to welcome everybody to the Teaching with Primary Sources Eastern Region webinar, What's New About Fake News. I'm Barb Kirby, and I'm the Director of the Eastern Region, and I'm joined by my colleague.
Hi, I'm Sue Wise, and I will be monitoring text chat throughout the webinar and collecting your questions.
Super, Sue, thanks. Sue will share those questions with Megan towards the end of our program. As you know, media literacy is more important than ever, and it's definitely a hot topic today. We're pleased to have had 40 educators register for this webinar representing 15 different states. And today we're going to examine the issues and the history of fake news. We are recording this session, and it'll be posted online with the slides later on this week or early next week. To ensure the best possible experience, we'd ask you to mute yourselves, but please remember your questions are very important to us and to Megan, and there will be time at the end. So use that chat box, send your questions throughout the program, and Sue will gather those up and present them towards the end. So let's jump in. Today we're pleased to welcome Dr. Meghan Manfra, Associate Professor at North Carolina State University. Meghan is the Social Studies Education Professor at North Carolina State. She's also a researcher focused on the integration of technology in secondary social studies classrooms and in using class action research as a professional development tool for teachers. Meghan's also one of our TPS Eastern Region grantees through NC State. She's the editor of the Handbook of Social Studies Research at Wiley Press. She's an extensive background in educational research and evaluation. She's a former high school teacher and past chair of the executive board of the CUFA Assembly at the National Council for the Social Studies. Meghan's published numerous journal articles and is the author of a forthcoming book of action research for classrooms, schools, and communities. She also conducted a successful project connecting Carolina for North Carolina educators. So I'll remind you again to please mute, and I please welcome Meghan and all of our guests.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here with you this afternoon.
You are not allowed to leave the room again. You just came up.
Meghan, I'm going to mute everybody and then unmute you, okay?
Okay, sounds good.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so we can go ahead and get started then.
Go ahead.
Great. Well, welcome again. Appreciate you joining me. I just wanted to start off, and any presentation when we talk about fake news or issues that are politically sensitive, to just acknowledge that there are many feelings, strong feelings about this topic, and as teachers, we need to be sure to acknowledge those feelings and to also think about in advance ways that we'll work with our students to engage in dialogue and real civic dialogue that seems to be unfortunately missing in a lot of our public spaces. So let's go ahead and jump in. Since the 2016 United States presidential election, there's been an accounting of the impact of fake news on the electorate. For example, a recent Dartmouth study suggests that 1 in 4 Americans visited a fake news site in the month leading up to the 2016 election. Fake news was the word of the year for several dictionaries, and you may have seen this list of the top 5 fake election stories by Facebook engagement. As we prepare for the midterm elections, fake news continues to remain in the news and to be a salient issue. So why is it so hard for us to identify fake news? Take, for instance, this headline that went viral online recently. Is it real or is it fake? You can see the headline says 5,000 people dump shoes in front of Nike headquarters. The small print says that Nike's been making Americans really mad by hiring Colin Kaepernick to be the face of their Just Do It campaign. But we doubt anyone expected Americans to be this furious. So again, is it fake news? How can we tell? Perhaps one issue is that in determining this as whether or not it's fake news is that there's similar headlines that we've been bombarded with. So take, for example, the Bloomberg or CBS Bay Area or Washington Post headline, all about the same issue. So returning to this breaking headline about 5,000 people dumping shoes in front of Nikes, it's hard for us to really determine whether or not it's fake because of something called confirmation bias. When things seem to corroborate what we already know or what we've seen in other places, then we're more likely to judge it as credible. However, if we look more deeply at this particular story, you can see that the picture was lifted from a 2009 article that appeared in an online news outlet in Hawaii that was about another Nike program encouraging customers to reuse their shoes. So within the proper context, this picture takes on a very different context, or different meaning, rather. And so returning to this fake news headline or this particular instance, we have, of course, to determine that it's fake. Again, it's just important to keep in mind that multiple studies have shown us that when we're faced with information that contradicts our beliefs, the part of our brain that controls the ability to reason tends to shut down. When we're confronted with new information, judgments about what is true and credible are often shaped more by how well this information aligns with our prior beliefs than by how well individuals are able to reason. I believe a key part of media literacy is to recognize confirmation bias, to help our students understand it, and to be on the lookout. So before we move further, I just wanted to pause for some reflection. As you think about these terms, media literacy and fake news, they're really fraught with political meaning these days. So for you, before you get started and we move forward, I'd like you to just consider how you define media literacy. What does it mean to you? What does it look like? What are some of the biggest issues facing educators relevant to teaching media literacy? And then how confident are you in your ability to identify fake news? So there's kind of two issues here, right? There's us as educators kind of thinking about media literacy as a skill we want students to learn and some of the issues that we face. But then also as political beings, as civically engaged, we're also confronted by fake news, and we have to navigate those pathways. So perhaps we can return to these questions towards the end of the webinar, and I'd be interested in your take on these issues. So our agenda for today is, first we're going to frame the issues, then we'll look to strategies for teaching media literacy, and try to look back to the past to help reframe media literacy today. So over the course of this webinar, we'll consider ways to help our students identify fake news and become more media savvy. So in terms of framing the issue, it's really important to note, and this is probably common knowledge, that the important role that social media plays in the lives of teens today. A recent Pew Internet survey demonstrates that 95% of teens have smartphones and 45% say they're online almost constantly. So if you look at this graphic, I think it's really important to see the most common or most popular online platforms that students are using. And you'll notice that the majority of these, so YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at the top, really represent a distributed approach to information. So there's no centralized authority in these places. And this is where teens are commonly going to find information. And teens are well aware of some of the issues related with their use of social media. So another study, or that rather than that same study, represents these mixed views students have about social media and its effects on people their age. So on one hand, they see positive impacts like being able to make connections, but at the same time, they find negative impacts, including bullying, etc. So our role as educators is really to guide students to help them navigate social media, their use of social media, to not only develop media literacy, but I'm increasingly thinking about issues like digital health, to encourage students to think really carefully about how often, how frequently they're online and how it impacts them. A recent study by the Stanford History Education Group demonstrates that students need a lot of support when it comes to media literacy. This series of studies is really interesting, and I recommend that you seek it out to learn more about their work determining students' ability to reason online. They found that students have a very difficult time understanding credible sources or identifying credible sources from those that are less credible, and they really connect this to our democratic traditions and civic issues. So media literacy is a part of the social studies. I think it's a part of probably schooling in general and education in general. We can make direct connections to our field of social studies, though. For instance, the National Council of Social Studies in their position statement refers to media literacy as an essential skill for active citizenship. Similarly, the more recent C3 framework focuses on evaluating sources and using evidence. So for us, again, as educators, not only that connection of teen media use, but it's also thinking about this as part of the content that we should be teaching and needing to be teaching. So when I think about fake news, I really put it on a continuum between hoaxes and misrepresentations. So hoaxes are fabricated content, outright falsehoods, and lies. And then on the other hand, it's a little bit more cloudy or gray areas with misrepresentation. So this is places where things are issues of emphasis, distortion, and omission. So we'll go through and look at examples of each of these. It's important, though, that both are meant to deceive and distort. And again, I think this contributes to the complexity of helping our students develop media literacy and navigate fake news. So let's start with this ad. It kind of looks like a coupon. If you can read the fine print, it says that they're going to be offering 75% off any purchase of Nike shoes, extended to all people of color in particular. So this is an outright hoax. It was created by users of the controversial online forum called 4chan, and they produced this racially charged and potentially dangerous fake coupon in the aftermath of Nike's endorsement deal with Colin Kaepernick. The issue here is that today, things like this that are created, whether they're memes or tweets or images, can spread so rapidly through social media and online that even if at the source you identify it as being from a satirical site or being a hoax, it's often spread to other places on the internet. It pops up in forums, it's retweeted, et cetera. And so it's very difficult to kind of constantly identify these hoaxes and to draw people's attention to them. So some examples of emphasis here. Both of these are, on the left-hand side, it's an Instagram screenshot, and the right's a tweet. And what's important here is the wording, the way in which certain words are juxtaposed with images. So on the left-hand side, for example, the insertion that marijuana was found in the apartment of this young man who was killed by a police officer. And then on the right, you might notice how women's replaced by prostitutes in a later post. So that sort of the approach here of changing even the wording and the way in which that changes the meaning for the user and the messaging of the content. Here's another example. Again, this isn't fake. This came from Angela Merkel's Instagram feed after the G8 summit. What's interesting, though, is how the same picture is picked up by other Instagram users. So, for instance, John Bolton used the same image but with a very different message on his Instagram page. So here he says, just another G7 where other countries expect America will always be their bank. The president made it clear today, no more. So the body language that you may have read in the first image from Angela Merkel changes in John Bolton's Instagram feed here because of the way he's framing it. And then a third image posted by People's Daily from China juxtaposes Angela Merkel's conference with a conference that was held on the same day. So taken together, I think these three represent some examples of emphasis. Again, they're not fake. However, the messages that the viewers get changes based on the juxtaposition of text and images. Again, we really need to consider the source. And that's one big important piece of media literacy that we want to help our students begin to develop. And then finally, an example of omission. I'll give you a chance to read this excerpt. So taken at face value, perhaps none of the sentences is untrue. Each of those sentences represents factual information about Adolf Hitler, except there's something major that's been omitted here, right? Of course, it's the Holocaust. 6 million Jews, over 17 million victims, World War II, the aggression on the parts of the German army. All of those things are omitted here. And so I think this is although this is a fictionalized account created by an author who was interested in helping kind of really emphasize the importance of students understanding historical narrative, I think this just provides a really strong reminder of how important it is to think fully about the way an account is created and presented and what might be omitted. So there are currently quite a few providers that have developed heuristics for helping students develop those habits of mind or those skills that are necessary to do the things that we just did as we looked at those images or those pictures, to kind of consider the source, to look at who created it and why, and what those bias might be. 3 I really recommend are Project Look Sharp, the News Literacy Project, and Museum. Barb and Sue have a list of URLs for all of these that you'll have available to you at the end of the webinar. So the first one is the ESCAPE acronym from the Museum. And if you want to dig in a little bit more deeply to what ESCAPE stands for, you see that it's fairly similar to other heuristics. It tries to lead students through a series of steps, in this case 6 steps, where they consider evidence, source, context, audience, purpose, and execution. So the aim of all of these heuristics is to provide students with scaffolding, right? So just as you imagine you're building a building, eventually that scaffolding should be removed and it become automatic for students. So the message here is that we can really help teach students skills in media literacy, although we know they have a difficult time, we all do, of navigating it. Through carefully crafted activities, we can encourage critical media literacy. But I think it's also important to connect this with helping students understand the cultural meaning of digital media and content. So that kind of leads us to the real purpose of today's webinar, which is asking the question of whether or not we can look to the past, and particularly the resources in the Library of Congress, to develop media literacy today. And I think in the back of my mind, and what I want to encourage us to also consider, is how looking to the past, examining historical resources, is different or similar to examining contemporary examples. Obviously, we benefit today about understanding the big picture of the past. We know what happens. We have the benefit of the present. And so it's really important for us to put media in proper historical context, but then also kind of think differently about what we're dealing with today. I do think one point that's important to make is that the reverse is already being done. Historical images are being used already to create an understanding of a contemporary issue. So just like we saw on those Instagram feeds earlier, it's powerful imagery alongside powerful text that's designed to create particular messages. So just to emphasize again that fake news is content in the social studies. It's important for us to help students examine historical examples of fake news or media, and to also understand media as a cultural text. It's created by people, to help develop students' awareness of bias and encourage them to seek accuracy and credibility of sources. So we're going to move forward and look at some resources from the Library of Congress to help us think through media as a cultural text. So by this we mean that all media is created and it has latent meaning. If we, through an analysis of media as a cultural text, we can uncover hidden ideas that's embedded within these texts and also understand the discourse of the day. So 3 questions that kind of go along with the notion of discourse analysis is first to start with very concrete questions, like what's notable about the image? What compositional elements do you notice? And then moving to the more inferential questions, like what seems to be the message here? And so this is kind of a common strategy for helping students understand bias. So this is a great definitions taken from the curriculum Facing History and Ourselves that help draw attention to the fact that things may have explicit bias or implicit bias, as well as, and then also that earlier idea that we talked about confirmation bias. And so these helping our students kind of navigate these different types of bias as well. So this is complicated work. Luckily, we have a variety of resources. The Library of Congress provides us kind of a tremendous playground for picking up these 3 approaches, right? So understanding media as a text, engaging our students in discourse analysis, and helping them understand bias. The library has already created some wonderful tools for us, like the primary source analysis tool. Again, another heuristic designed to scaffold students to support them as they analyze primary sources. So these can be used alongside a variety of parts of the collection. I recommend mainly the teachers collection, since they often have curated sets of primary sources that are available for teachers to use. I'd like to share some more specific examples for ways that we can take a long view of the American culture through media using some examples from the library's pages. So what do you see here in this page? On the top right, that small thumbnail is a screenshot of John Adams' diary. On the bottom right, you'll see a screenshot of the Boston Gazette, to which he refers in 1769. And then to the left, you'll see a transcript of his diary entry. So when you read the transcript, I want you to answer, how does he describe the process of developing the quote-unquote next day's newspaper? So what's their process here? So perhaps you picked up on that line about midway through when he talks about preparing the next day's newspaper as a quote-unquote curious employment, cooking up paragraphs, articles, and occurrences. So this source represents the way in which newspapers were used during the colonial and revolutionary period in the United States, or the pre-United States, to not only share information, but also to generate support for the revolutionary cause. Perhaps the episode that's most frequently cited in the struggle for public opinion occurred in March of 1770 in Boston. Here's a screenshot of the Boston Gazette from the Library of Congress Chronicling America collection. What happened in March of 1770? If you said the Boston Massacre, right? Here's a transcription of that. Kind of a lot of text here and somewhat hard to read. But if you just kind of scan this pretty quickly, you can see from this transcription how the Boston Gazette portrayed the event and the clear indication of who the perpetrators were and who were the victims. So it's not just newspapers that presented the story of the Boston Massacre, the people of Boston across the colonies. But also there are several images of the event that were spread, including this, I'm sure, very recognizable and famous print of an engraving by Paul Revere. So this is just a good example, I think, to demonstrate media as a cultural text, engaging students in discourse analysis about images and seeking out bias. So this particular image was produced just 3 weeks after the Boston Massacre. It's titled The Bloody Massacre in King Street, and many historians consider it a pretty effective piece of war propaganda. Not exactly an accurate depiction of the event, but we could guide students through the elements of the imagery that Paul Revere used to shape public opinion. For instance, notice the way the British are lined up and an officer is giving an order to fire, implying the British are aggressors. Notice the way the colonists are shown reacting to the British when other accounts suggest they actually attack the soldiers. You may notice differences in the way the British faces are sharper and the Americans are more soft. And just on and on, if you kind of look around the painting, perhaps you see the woman in the rear of the crowd kind of playing on notions of chivalry, the sky, the way in which the sky is illustrated, and again, the stance of the military posture of those soldiers. So for students to get a really full understanding of the Boston Massacre and the event that occurred there, they'll need to dig more deeply in the archive. So, for example, they might read some of the transcript from the trial of the British soldiers who were actually famously represented by John Adams, and the words of their captain, Thomas Preston, who noted that the soldiers felt that they were under attack by the colonists. In a related vein, it's also worthwhile to note that Crispus Attucks, perhaps one of the more famous victims of the massacre, really didn't play a very central role in the imagery of the event until much later in the 19th century. So here you see two different prints that put him more at the center of the battle. He served as an important symbol for both the abolitionist movement and then later in some of the civil rights movements. He's referenced by Booker T. Washington, Martin Luther King Jr. And again, students could look at these images to think about not only the imagery, but the messaging that's implied. So while those new resources about the Boston Massacre are more nuanced and can demonstrate some of the cultural discourse of the time, there's also several examples we could turn to of outright hoaxes and fake news, including this spoofed paper, really, printed by Benjamin Franklin in 1782. He concocted an entirely fake issue of a real Boston newspaper called the Independent Chronicle and fabricated a story of abuses at the frontier of New York. And the story is pretty gruesome. And none of it was true, but it did strike a chord. And so students could be, sort of asked to think about, well, why would he have written this, and what might be the ramifications of this type of account on the frontier? Other sort of famous hoaxes that appeared in newspapers include the Great Moon Hoax, a story that appeared in the New York Sun in 1835, claiming that life had been discovered on the moon. The New York Sun was founded in 1833 and it was one of several new sort of penny press papers that appealed to a wider audience and at a cheaper price and a more of a narrative style. It was probably pretty exciting to the readers at the time, but the problem was none of it was true. However, to understand why such outrageous stories that we consider outrageous today gain such attention, students could put them in the proper context alongside other accounts of scientists and explorers who really were working on developing air travel, including this screenshot from a newspaper that suggests Professor Lewis, who is going to try to circumnavigate the world with his hot air balloon. Of course, yellow journalism is probably the most famous examples we can turn to of the past to look at sensationalized newspaper accounts that were used for political purposes. Yellow journalism is a term for journalism and that present little or no legitimate, well-researched news, while instead using eye-catching headlines. Probably, the term originated in the competition over the New York City newspaper market, famously between those two publishers, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. Interestingly, at first, yellow journalism had nothing to do with reporting, and actually was because of a cartoon, a a cartoon character called the Yellow Kid, and there was a fight between Hearst and Pulitzer over the cartoonist to gain readership. But once it was coined, that term yellow journalism extended to any kind of sensationalist style employed by the two publishers. Perhaps the most famous sort of example occurred in 1898, and that's what you're seeing here when the U.S. battleship, the Maine, was sunk in the Havana harbor. Hearst and Pulitzer both published rumors, like the one you see here, of plots to sink the ship. Some think that it may have contributed to eventual war, although there were a variety of issues that contributed. So we have this tremendous collection of newspapers available to us in Chronicling America, and those are just a few examples of ways that we can look across time to see how newspapers have been used. I want to go into a little bit more detail to look at two events in particular. I think what these do is help frame the newspaper industry and sort of the growth of newspapers, and help students understand how that information and the spread of information was used for political expedience. So here you see the front page of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. He was an immigrant who came to the United States and started a newspaper in 1855, and it was one of the first successful pictorial newspapers. And what he quickly found as he started trying to publish was that activism, sensationalism, and tell-alls sold. So maybe sort of modern day almost tabloids, although he is credited with having much more sort of bipartisan and fact-based reporting. He finally found a real stable readership in his extensive coverage of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and the ensuing trial and execution. So here you see a screenshot of John Brown. He tells the background of Brown and what happened at Harper's Ferry. And then in the next slide, you see an example of taken from John Brown's raid at the Harper's Ferry Arsenal on October 16th of 1859. So it was this sort of behind-the-scenes reporting that apparently was very appealing to his readers. Now, you could ask students to corroborate his account with other accounts of the day. So take, for example, and what I did here is just searched for Harper's Ferry in the Chronicling America, and this is what came up. So the Southerner, a Tarboro, North Carolina paper, described the raid as startling news. Another newspaper, this one from Iowa, described John Brown and his fellows' defense of the Constitution, and it connected the events at Harper's Ferry with the events of Bleeding Kansas. And again, about a couple years later, an anti-slavery newspaper, the Anti-Slavery Bugle, referred to the martyrs at Harper's Ferry. So again, these papers provide a snapshot about regional differences in reporting the news and may help students hone their skills of identifying bias. Like today, advances in technology, as we mentioned, the penny press and faster printing presses and the telegraph revolutionized journalism during the 19th century. There was something of an information revolution at the time, probably unparalleled until the more recent internet revolution, that led to a rapid rise of newspapers. This helped to foster what's considered a really hyper-literate environment during the Civil War that Lincoln had to contend with. It's important for students to understand that at the dawn of the war, there were around 4,000 newspapers in the country, and about 80% of them were political in nature. And during the Civil War, Lincoln faced a nation, again, transformed by information. He recognized, in his words, that public sentiment is everything. And it's interesting because Lincoln's been invoked recently, actually, in political rallies and references with fake news. Probably one of the more well-known examples is this seen here. So this is a screenshot of what's called the gold hoax, the Civil War gold hoax of 1864. It appeared simultaneously in the New York World and the New York Journal of Commerce. So if you're keeping track, so those are some of the more penny presses, or what we might consider more like tabloid presses of the time. And in this, kind of highlighted at the bottom, you see that it suggests that Lincoln is going to draft more soldiers, so 400,000 new troops. Well, it turns out that this was published by two men who were hoping to manipulate the gold market. And so just like today, when political events might depress the markets, they hope the same, and they're sort of betting against the market. So there were examples like this where Lincoln had to contend with outright hoaxes. He called these men treasonous. And then also the photojournalism of the day, which brought home images of the Civil War, perhaps made most famous by Matthew Brady, who published books of images that were shared during the time. It's believed that there were over 3,000 photographers who made war-related images during the Civil War. They documented battlefields, soldiers' activities, and eventually the destructive effects of conflict on civilians. This is a screenshot, again, from the Library of Congress's collection of Civil War photojournalism. So these photographs captured the realities of war. However, sometimes the scenes were manipulated themselves. One example here is the home of the Rebel Sharpshooter. Thanks to some really important sleuthing, we know that this body was moved into position here, and this image of the Confederate soldier lying dead near the northern slope of Devil's Den. After capturing several images, they probably moved the body, they think about 40 yards, to make this iconic image. So again, the question for us is to think about the way in which these media images have been created and for what purposes, and what kind of message is the viewer intended to receive. So speaking of which, you might compare some of that messaging with the National Labor Committee images made famous by the work of Lewis Hine, who also staged some of his shots, but importantly were intended, again, to raise awareness. So all of these historic examples we just evaluated, I think, point to the complexity of the role of media in defining important political events for us. They help raise awareness, they spread news, but they also present images and stories in ways that frame our impression. That's probably why the free press has also been referred to as the fourth estate. Edmund Burke reportedly said there are three estates, but the reporter's gallery, there's that a fourth estate more important than all. So this could lead to conversations with our students about the importance of the press and the free press. For example, you see some screenshots here of the press coverage of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and television and newspaper images brought home the brutality of the movement to everybody's homes. There's also the press famously investigating the Watergate break-in, exposing the Nixon scandal and eventually leading to his resignation. And then more recently, the press played a role in unveiling the NSA mass surveillance programs. So again, kind of leading us to thinking about journalism and photojournalism, and in covering recent controversies and issues related to human rights. Another direction we might take to help students unpack some of the complexity of historic examples is the role of persuasion or propaganda. A striking example of this for me is the Charles Paxson carte de visite here. These were small prints of slave children from New Orleans. They were printed on cardstock and sold commercially. They were popular collectibles during the Victorian period. Some say this may have marked the beginning of sort of celebrity culture. But if you look at these images really closely, the questions are raised include, what image ideas do you think these images were trying to promote? And then if you knew that these children toured the North between December of 1863 and January of 1864, what then does that tell you about what these images were trying to promote? So I'm not sure if you can see the fine print, but the left-hand image is Wilson, Charlie, Rebecca, and Rosa, and it says at the bottom, slaves from New Orleans. On the right, Rosa, Charlie, Rebecca, slave children from New Orleans. So again, other questions we might ask about these images are, what questions do they raise about race in 19th century New Orleans? How is the whiteness of the children important and as part of the messaging of the artist? Again, returning to the National Child Labor Committee collection, children are used again to evoke emotion. So as you look at these closely, what feelings or emotions were these images aiming to evoke? What were the political purposes of these images, and how successful were they? Another set of images or created media in the Library of Congress collection is the World War I poster collection. This extensive collection of government-produced propaganda. Major themes that you see if you look closely at the images include patriotism, nationalism. This became sort of iconic. A lot of the symbolism we identify today came from this period. They were developed by a government committee for public information under their chairman, George Creel. And they were designed to convince a really reluctant isolationist nation to become involved in the war. So again, we can ask students to examine these images, to think about the discourse that is being created and the way in which the imagery alongside the text evokes particular feelings and messaging. And then after the war, the way images were used to frame the way America responded to veterans and made sense of the war. So that was a lot all at once, but I just wanted to reiterate that all of this work, understanding media as a cultural text, analyzing discourse, and seeking to understand bias, is not intended to make our students cynical. We don't want them to think that everything that they see is false or that they cannot trust, but rather to understand newspapers and media are produced by real people with agendas who may be reacting to specific social, cultural, economic, and political contexts. So looking at those historical sources, that helps us understand the importance of putting things in their proper context, understanding authorship, and understanding the purpose of the object. However, I think that we also need to really acknowledge that it's important for students to understand the evolving role of media today. So it can't make direct lines, for instance, between Franklin's newspaper and what we're seeing happen today, because the internet revolution and social media has created a far different framework for us to understand. At the same time today, we have to acknowledge the sort of double meaning about fake news, that it's used both to refer to media which is fabricated, and it's also fake news. That term is evoked out of political expedience to call into question true accounts that go against policy and to call into question the role of the free press. So one way to help students sort of navigate this, you see a screenshot from the New York Times. Other newspapers and news sources have similar, to help students understand contemporary journalism, the field, the way it has evolved, the standards of journalistic ethics. There's also been quite a few resources produced that help students understand how journalists actively work to minimize bias, including from Facing History. See a screenshot there. And then helping students place contemporary media literacy within the frame of today, the internet revolution. This is a screenshot of the war room at Facebook. And you may have heard that it's the company's hub for safeguarding our elections around the world, where they have this team of people trying to identify fake news. And so, kind of importantly, for our students to consider why war rooms like this exist, why they have to exist, and why they're and the role of fake news on the elections. And then finally, it's important to consider new technologies that are on the horizon. So again, the history of technology is important for the way in which our country's developed and the way it will continue to develop. So if you think about things like artificial intelligence and virtual rendering, students could think about the way these technologies will play a future role in the struggle for public opinion and the way we interact with each other and with technology. So we covered a lot today. Again, I encourage you to review the list of URLs, including some additional resources about heuristics for media literacy, to make this a part of your teaching and a part of the way you work with your students. I'm very happy to answer some questions now. And then you also have my email address here. I welcome your feedback and any suggestions you have. I'm particularly always looking for great examples of fake news, both today and in the past. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. That was a terrific presentation. Sue, did you collect some questions for us? So I think you're on mute, so if you want to start over.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Sure can.
Okay, great. So, Megan, it's interesting that some of the examples that you brought up about the parallels, particularly with Lincoln and that whole, spread and sharing of information that became suddenly available is very similar to what has happened with the internet. And so I was wondering about the what your perspective is on how that might or might not be related to political swings.
Right, and I think the Lincoln example has been salient in conversations today because not only was it a time period of sort of communication revolution, as they described a sort of hyper-literate environment where more information was more readily available, but also it was a time of heightened uncertainty, more and more polarization, as a nation divided on the brink of a civil war. And so I think that's why this example of Lincoln is salient. Probably don't want to overstate too much the direct connection, thinking about the U.S. today is on the brink of civil war, but certainly it provides sort of a historical antecedent for thinking through the way Lincoln as a president was navigating that information age and the use of newspapers. And he used them well for his own purposes, but also had to respond to criticism and to hoaxes like we saw there that were appearing.
One thing that this conversation made me think of was I just read a thing in it was a commentary in Education Week, and it talks about how the title of it was "How History Class Divides Us," and the premise of the discussion is are some of these things that we have traditionally accepted as facts and real and givens are some of these the results of the Civil War, the purposes of the Civil War, called into question by current populations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's where this issue of evidence is so important. On one hand, we've kind of taught the notion that there's multiple perspectives, but we can't assume that multiple perspectives about the past are equal because of the historical evidence. So we know that those historical arguments that have been made, those things that we talk about in our history class, are based on considerable historical evidence. And so that's where we continue to try to frame our curriculum. And so, of course, the most noticeable example of this, or perhaps extreme, is the example of the Holocaust deniers, who might suggest the event did not occur, whereas we have tremendous evidence, of the event and of the victims. And so we just have to kind of keep returning and reminding our students about the importance of these historical accounts being built on historical evidence.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Multiple perspectives doesn't necessarily mean multiple truths.
Right. Yeah.
Any other questions for Meghan today?
So again, I welcome any questions or comments that you think of on to my email address, and then also kind of returning to the questions that I used to frame this about this presentation about what are the implications for us as teachers, what are some of the issues that we face. I really welcome your feedback and suggestions as well.
Meghan, we really appreciate your willingness to follow up with us afterwards and to continue to share information. That's a terrific offer. I just want to make a program note that, your slides you made available to us, they'll be available on the website next week, and we'll email you a link for both the slides, the recorded webinar, and then Meghan has a terrific list of URLs with all of the materials that she's referenced in the presentation today. We truly appreciate you joining us, and we do have an evaluation. You can click on it in your chat box or type it from here. We'd appreciate your feedback. Everything that we do, we try to build in your suggestions. So we welcome your feedback and recommendations for future topics. We do have another webinar slated for the spring. Then the topic is to be announced. But on behalf of the entire TPS Eastern region, thanks to you, Meghan, and thank you everybody for participating. And Sue says that the evals are popping into the inbox now, so very much appreciated. Again, if you can't get a hold of Meghan, Sue and I can be very helpful. Welcome.
You know where to find me.
Connect you exactly. That's right.
Right.
And again, we'll share that out. So terrific program. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Have a great day, folks.